So welcome everybody to our Pollinator Pals, which is the fourth of our winter web series. And we've got two special guests with us tonight, Lydia Wong and Susan Gordon. And Susan's going to be chatting first, probably mostly about butterflies, and then Lydia will be up after that. So Susan is a PhD candidate in the Jeremy Kerr Microecology and Conservation Lab, and she investigates the factors that structure butterfly meta-communities and how the interactions with different predators and mutualistic plant community or partners impact butterfly species, presence, and abundance. So she did her undergrad thesis on beaver herbivory and built on that research by studying an ant plant seed dispersal mutualism with Dr. Megan Fredrickson after graduation. She's also a lab manager and a research technician in Dr. Marjorie Weber's evolutionary biology lab at the Michigan State University, working on a plant mite defense mutualism. My goodness, very accomplished. So I will introduce Lydia when she's up. So Susan, I will turn this over to you, and I will stop sharing my screen so that you can pop yours up.
Okay, where is it? Got too many screens going right now. Okay, I think that should be working.
That's perfect. I can definitely see it. I think everybody else can. If anybody can't, just put something in the chat.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sharon, for that great introduction. Yeah, so I'm Susan. I'm doing my PhD studying butterflies, and I just wanted to start out with a little sort of pitch for anyone who's interested in butterflies to check out my study site, which is this really beautiful area. It's called Burnt Lands Provincial Park. It's just outside of Ottawa by Mississippi Mills. So if you have a day and you want to go look at some beautiful plants, butterflies, there's lots of wildlife there. It's a very cool area. It's got a lot of these like big sort of open grassland areas that butterflies love. And so these are a couple of the species that I saw when I was out there doing fieldwork, monarch butterflies, of course. And then this image with the black and yellow butterfly is a giant swallowtail butterfly. They're the biggest butterfly in North America. So it was really exciting to see those. So go check out Burnt Lands. And it's very small. You can just, there's no sort of like booth or anything there with park staff. You just go on park nearby and go for a walk. Okay. So today I'm talking about supporting butterflies, how to support butterflies in your backyard, or, you know, I know Hampton Park has been doing things to support butterflies, so wherever you're able to. And butterflies are so cool. I'm sure, you know, you guys are here because you love, hopefully, butterflies and bees. But butterflies are great. Obviously, they're pollinators. They're also often used as indicator species. So they're quite sensitive to environmental changes. So scientists tend to use them as indicators of sort of when things are going wrong in a habitat. If the butterflies are affected, then we might expect other species to be effective later. There's sort of the, I guess, canary in the coal mine in some situations. And I also love studying and talking about butterflies because I think they're a really great entry point for people into conservation and science in general. They're really beautiful. They're fun to look at. And so it's just exciting to talk to kids or people who aren't necessarily into those things already. I think it's a great entryway into, yeah, conservation and science in general. So I also just wanted to say, of course, I'm sure a lot of you know that monarch butterflies were listed as an endangered species last year in the US. And this is just a graph of a trend of declining monarch populations with year on the bottom and the population size to the left there. And a lot of these kind of things look really dire, but it's actually surprising how much of an impact gardeners and people working in, you know, small parks can have on butterflies. And I'm going to talk about the sort of benefits of working that kind of, I guess, environment a bit later. But it's really exciting to be talking to people who have the opportunity to, you know, plant butterfly-friendly plants in the garden and are motivated to do it because it can make a big difference. So just to refresh everybody's memories, I'm sure everyone already knows this, but this is the life cycle of a butterfly. And so you have an adult butterfly in this case of monarch butterfly that lays its eggs on a host plant. And depending on the species of butterfly, they could have a lot of different host plants, like up to 100 different species could be a host plant for that butterfly, or it could just be, a handful or fewer. So it's really dependent on the species. And I'm going to be talking about host plants later on. So of course, the adults lay their eggs on a host plant, the caterpillar munches away and grows up on that host plant, develops a chrysalis, and then within that chrysalis, the caterpillar transforms into a butterfly. And then as an adult butterfly, of course, the butterfly needs nectar. And so depending on, what kind of host plant it is, they might need to leave that host plant. It might not really produce nectar. And so they need sort of different things at different stages of their lives. And I already talked about that. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about before I get into talking about plants is just a little pitch for keeping butterflies safe over the winter. So butterflies can actually overwinter in any of these life stages. So a few species do overwinter as adults. They'll just sort of, crawl under leaves. Some of them overwinter as eggs, as caterpillars, or as chrysalises. And so this is an example of a butterfly that you might see in Ottawa. It's fairly common in this area. It's called a morning cloak. And so you can see it open there the way that most people would probably picture, but also closed. And this species overwinters as adults. And so you can see when it has its wings closed, it basically looks like a dried up leaf. And so you can imagine in your garden, when you're sort of doing whatever you choose to do with your leaves to get prepared for winter. It would be pretty easy, if you're bagging your leaves or mulching them for a butterfly to get sort of caught up in that. This is another example. This is a cloudless sulfur butterfly, which isn't actually really found around Ottawa, but I think it's a really good example of how a chrysalis can also just look like a leaf. And so if you're able to, instead of bagging up your leaves or mulching them, just move them over your garden beds or, into a corner of your yard for the winter, because you could have hopefully, a number of butterflies at different life stages that are in that leaf pile. And then you're supporting them to, live to the next summer. Okay, so now on to host plants. And I'm going to start. Sharon gave me a list of plants that have been planted at Hampton Park, and it's actually a really great list. There's a lot of butterflies are being supported by the planting at Hampton Park. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about it. But just before I do, just in terms of if you're looking to plant host plants in your garden and you have like a garden bed in your yard, research on monarch butterflies actually has shown that monarch butterflies are more likely to find and lay eggs on milkweed that is around the edge of garden beds. So you can see, for example, if these are two garden beds, the red are milkweed, it's just easier for them to find the milkweed when it's right around the edge where I have the check mark. And so if you are looking to, specifically plant host plants for butterflies in your garden, I would recommend just trying to plant them around the edges. It's easier to see them. It's easier for butterflies to find them. Okay, so now on to some of the host plants that are planted at Hampton Park. So there's a lot of cool butterflies that you could potentially be attracting at Hampton Park. Of course, there's the monarch. You planted a few different types of milkweed. But there's also the painted lady and the American lady. And actually, it's interesting, all three of these species are migratory. And when we're thinking about attracting butterflies to more urban yards, migratory species are a really great way to go to sort of target to attract to our yards, because some of the resident species that live here all year round aren't as good of flyers as these species, like the painted lady, American lady, and monarch that are flying, in the case of monarch, over the course of, a couple generations, but they're still flying from Mexico to, southern Canada. And so they can get into cities and access those host plants that you're planting in your yard. And so for the painted lady, it actually uses a ton of plants as host plants. So there's a whole plant family called the Asteraceae family. So these are some examples of plants that your group has planted at Hampton Park. And compare that to a closely related species, the American lady, that mostly that has a much smaller group of species that it'll use as host plants. So one that you planted was a pearly everlasting. So like I said, there's a lot of variation in terms of how many options, I guess, butterflies have when they're, depending on the species, when they're trying to search around for their host plants. Yeah, but these are three that could definitely find those plants at Hampton Park. So these, on the other hand, are three species that are a lot smaller. They're definitely at sort of the small end of the spectrum in terms of butterfly size, and they are resident species. They're not migratory. And so, unfortunately, you're probably, even though their host plants are planted at Hampton Park, you're probably going to be less likely to see them just because they might not be able to get into the city to access the host plants. They just don't move as far. However, that's not for sure. So there's a chance that there could be a population. I know there's an area along the river that the NCC has just been planting a lot of wildflowers there. It's hard to know what could actually happen. But these are just less likely to be seen. However, you have the spring azure, which is an early emerging species, which is really beautiful, that uses black snakeroot. The columbine dusky wing, which from its name, you can probably tell, it uses columbine as a host plant. And then there are three crescent species that look very similar, and they're a really beautiful species. And they use asters. And so, yeah, hopefully, I would love to come to Hampton Park and see these species. And then these three species, actually, yes, I think. Sorry, let me just double check before I say this. I have my butterfly book here. I think the Gorgon, or the common Buckeye, sorry, is migratory. But these other two species are not. They're a little more kind of medium size, so there's maybe a better chance that they could access the resources at Hampton Park. But the early hair streak is a species that uses American beech. So we might think that a lot of butterflies use flowering plants for their host plants, but actually they can use, depending on the species, they might use shrubs, trees, grasses. And so there's a real variety of plants that you can plant in your garden that support different butterfly species. Okay, common Buckeye is migratory. Okay, I apologize. The common Buckeye is migratory. So you would be more likely to see that at Hampton Park. And then, of course, you have the Gorgon checker spot and silvery checker spot, which are really beautiful butterflies. And they use black-eyed Susan as host plants, which is one of my favorite flowers. Anyway. And finally, this is one of the coolest butterflies I think that you can see in Ontario. It's called the black swallowtail, and it's actually, you've already planted at Hampton Park, a native species called Zizia aurea. Oh shoot, I probably should have written the common name, I'm sorry. That uses, so black swallowtails use this plant. And this is actually a fairly
It's Golden Alexander.
Okay, thank
It's
you.
the common name.
Golden Alexander. Thanks a lot, Sharon. And this is a species that's actually seen somewhat frequently in people's backyards because it uses other carrot plants or within the carrot family as host plants. And so you can actually plant carrots, excuse me. I believe dill is another big one that black swallowtail butterflies are really attracted to. And so this is kind of a fun one for the garden because You know, you don't have to plant wildflowers necessarily. You can plant cultivated species just, you know, in your veggie plot, and they can attract these really beautiful butterflies. So this is my last species for the Hampton Park planting, but I was really impressed. I think without even trying to, just by choosing native species, your Hampton Park group was able to plant a lot of plants that support butterflies. And that's definitely a big lesson when you're choosing plants to support butterflies, is that, you know, the reason that in a lot of cases these butterflies use these host plants is because they've, you know, evolved over time. They've been living alongside these host plants for so long. When, you know, the host plants are native to their area, it's more likely that they're going to, or when a plant is native to their area, it's just more likely that it'll be a host plant for a native butterfly. So yeah, definitely when you're thinking of on the whole, aside from what I just talked about carrot family, when you're thinking about species to plant in your garden to support butterflies, definitely think about native plants. Oh, sorry. So this is my last slide about Hampton Park. So there are a couple superstars that I wanted to point out: the Canadian milk veg and the purple prairie clover. So these are from a plant family called Fabaceae. And this family includes clovers. So there's actually a lot, you know, just sort of in people's yards maybe that they're trying to get rid of. But these are host plants for a number of species. So here we've got the gray hair streak, which is the sort of gray one with the orange. And then the eastern tail blue and the western tail blue, which are the gray with the dots. The clouded sulfur, which is the yellow one. And then I think that's a silvery blue in the middle. And so if you're looking to attract sort of a wider variety of butterflies with one single plant, I think this is a good option. Or, you know, either of these species or another species that's part of this plant family is a really good option. Yeah. So these are some additional species that you could think about planting to attract to your yard. And so these are really strong flyers. And in the case of a red admiral, it's another migratory species. And so, like I said earlier, these are the ones that are more likely to sort of be able to get through the city to access your yard. And in the case of the tiger swallowtail and the white admiral, they, again, tend to use sort of trees or shrubs. So tulip tree is a really beautiful tree. They grow super huge though. So, you know, that's a big decision for your yard. But then willows, which can be more contained, and cherry trees as well. Similar for white admiral. And then for red admiral, they're nettles. So maybe not quite as attractive for, you know, a small yard, but if you have an area maybe that you're okay to not walk through. I'm not sure about that one, but the red admiral is a really beautiful butterfly. So I would strongly consider thinking about that. Another thing that I just wanted to talk about briefly when you're thinking about, if you're trying to really be specific about the host plants that you're using, is you can use a tool like EButterfly. So these are some screenshots I took earlier today when I was looking at the website for EButterfly. And so basically what you can do is if you navigate from the home page, click on Explore Data and then Observations, you get this map with all of these green dots on it. And these dots are all observations of butterflies. So here I've looked at Hampton Park. And then if you click on a green dot, like I did here, then you can see all of the species that someone observed at that location. And so if you live by Hampton Park and you want to plant host plants for butterflies that are likely to be in your area, then you can actually have a look at eButterfly or at iNaturalist and try to find butterflies that are likely to live close to you and are likely to actually get into your garden. So I think this is a really great tool, especially if you live in different areas of the city. You might live near a park that has you know, butterflies that are less likely to be elsewhere in the city, or maybe if you live at the edge of the city, yeah, you might be able to attract more butterflies or more diverse butterfly species. So I'm just going to chat briefly about flowering plants. I'm guessing this is a lot of what Lydia is going to be talking about. So I'll be brief here. But basically, when you're really talking about any pollinators, including butterflies, a couple of things to keep in mind are diversity of flowering plants, and then thinking about having flowering plants that flower throughout the season. So these are a couple examples of species that I love, that are really beautiful, that are native, and that flower sort of at either end of the season when you might not see a lot of other flowers out there. So the eastern redbud is a really early flowering species of tree, and it's great for pollinators in the spring. And then in the fall, of course, you have gorgeous pairing goldenrod and purple asters. And so trying to think about your garden, planning flowers that flower from the spring to the fall is a really great way to support butterflies throughout the season. And in addition, including a diversity of flowering plants in your garden is really great. So trying to have a few different plants that flower at once, as opposed to maybe, one plant or one color of plant that flowers at once. Research has shown that having a lot of different plants and more abundant plants that are flowering at once is better at attracting butterflies and other pollinators. So this last thing that I wanted to talk about is the value of small gardens. So obviously, places like Burntlands that I was talking about before, where there are a lot of butterflies living, there are these huge areas, and we just can't, replicate that in our gardens. However, there's actually a really great benefit for some, in some cases, for smaller areas of host plants and flowering plants. So studies have shown that in areas that are a little bit more isolated, so for example, a backyard that's a little more isolated from other butterfly habitat, and that's a little smaller than other butterfly habitat, there's actually a lower density of butterfly parasites. So it's less likely for a butterfly to sort of come to harm by visiting those flowers. It was found that monarchs tend to lay more eggs on patches of milkweed that are smaller and more isolated, likely also for the same reason that there are fewer parasites there. And research that I've conducted has shown that the strong flyers, like I was talking about the migratory species or other strong flyers, actually might seek out these spots that are small and more isolated, potentially for these reasons that they're sort of, them and their eggs are sort of less in danger there. So this is why I'm really excited to talk to you all today, because I really think that there's a lot of value in whatever size yard you have and however much you can dedicate to host plants and flowering plants. Especially, as I said, if you're looking at those really strong flyers, they are going to be able to get to your yard, and they can really benefit. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you.
And I look forward to hearing Lydia's talk.
All right. Well, thanks, Susan. Just a couple of notes, too, is a lot of the species that on the list that I sent you are also in Carlington. They were probably in Carlington first before we put them into Hampton. So we're bookending the Queensway, at least, on either side of the Queensway.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, hoping to provide those little corridors. So Lydia, if you are up, I will give a quick introduction for you as well. So Lydia, as I'd mentioned, is a PhD candidate in Jessica Forrest Lab, where they're exploring the effects of warming and drying climates on wild bees and wasps. And recently, she and Professor Forrest published the findings of a long-term bee monitoring study conducted at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in the Journal of Animal Ecology. Lydia is also involved in many other bee projects, all in the Rocky Mountains. But in the summer of 2020, the pandemic, unfortunately, she could not get to her Colorado field sites. So what she ended up doing was doing some citizen science with people in Toronto and Ottawa. So now she's working to train those citizen scientists to monitor bee and wasp nesting activity in pollinator hotels. So welcome, Lydia.
Okay. Are you able to see my screen and hear me?
Yes, I am, and we are.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that introduction, Sharon. So I'm gonna talk about bees, and and thank you to Susan too. I really enjoyed that. So I'm gonna talk about bees, and specifically, I guess, what we might want to think about in terms of planting things when we're keeping bees in mind. So Sharon's already introduced me, but I'll just quickly introduce you in my own cartoonish way. So I'm Lydia. I'm a PhD student at Ottawa U, supervised by Jessica Forrest, and I study the effects of climate change on pollinators, mostly bees, which I'll be mostly talking about tonight, but also wasps. So as Sharon mentioned, I do a lot of my work in the Colorado Rocky Mountains, far away from big cities. And it's been pretty cool to spend the past few summers here because it's quiet. There are tons of bees and flowers there. But at the same time, I'm also interested in the bees and wasps that share cities with us. And that's because the diversity of species we get here is actually really impressive, given that most of the time we don't really associate wildlife with big cities. And I think more and more there's a lot of interest among many different people in making cities welcoming places to insects like bees and wasps. And it's really exciting to see initiatives popping up everywhere by groups like the Friends of Carlington Woods in Hampton Park and the Clyde Pollinator Patch. I think these groups are really doing wonderful things, both for the critters here, but also because they help other people realize how cool and fascinating these insects are. I feel like I could spend an entire evening telling you about all the different kinds of bees we might see in the city because they're all so interesting and they're all so quirky. Just quickly, there are bees that are bright green or bright blue. There are ones that collect hairs from plants to line their nests, some that cut very circular pieces of leaf. Others get around by sneaking their eggs into other bees' nests. This wasp collects spiders to feed her young. And so they're just such a fascinating group of insects to learn about because they vary so widely in how they look and what they do. But I think the hope for today is to focus more on the applied dimension of our relationship with bees as green space designers who might want to make spaces that are welcoming to bees in cities. And specifically in terms of what kinds of plants we might want to incorporate into our landscapes. And I know Susan's talked a lot about different plants that might work well for butterflies. The way I think of it, I guess, is that much like we humans need to make sure we're getting all our nutrients to grow and survive from the food we eat, bees need to do the same, except that they're getting all of their nutrients only from flowers. Now, in the context of cities where humans are the ones making decisions about green spaces, in a way, we kind of determine what food bees have access to. And I think of ourselves almost like bee grocery store managers, because we're determining what products are in stock for these bees in terms of how we design our green spaces. So for tonight, I thought I'd choose a couple of things that might be good to consider when we're thinking about creating bee grocery stores. And these include nutrition. So what resources are bees actually getting from these flowers? And are they getting all the nutrients that they need? There's diet specialization. So some bees might have specific preferences or specializations towards specific groups of plants. And then there's physical access. So both bees and flowers come in all different shapes and sizes. So can bees actually access the pollen and nectar? And I think there are a lot of other considerations we can think about. Susan's mentioned a few too, but I thought we could just start with these for now. Not only because I think they help us, they help inform how we can design green spaces, but also I think they highlight how diverse bees are in terms of their shapes and sizes and their different behaviors. And I feel like that's a pretty fascinating aspect in itself. I'll mention that this list is adapted from Heather Holmes' work. She's the author of a whole bunch of really good resources about pollinator gardening. And so if you're interested in learning more, I feel like she's definitely someone to look into. Okay, so with that, I'll start with nutrition. This first piece of the story, thinking about what bees are actually getting from flowers. And in general, bees are accessing two main items. They're accessing nectar, which is kind of their main source of fuel for all that flying they do, because it's full of carbohydrates. And then they're also accessing pollen, which is their source of protein and fat. And I would say arguably this is the more important resource in the picture because pollen is essential for bee reproduction. So female bees need it in order to produce eggs, and they also collect it to feed their babies. And then on top of that, there's growing research to suggest that for a lot of bees, pollen can actually be medicinal for them if they have pathogen infections. So pollen's almost like mom food and baby food and medicine all in one. And it turns out that different plants can have different amounts of pollen and nectar. And on top of that, different plants present their pollen and nectar to pollinators differently because they're all different shapes and sizes. And so that might be important to know in terms of whether or not bees of different species can actually access these resources that we put in our gardens. And I think one example that comes to my mind is with bumblebees and bee balm or Monarda. And bee balm is often this plant that's marketed as a very good pollinator-friendly plant, hence the name. And I totally agree with that because it probably is a very good source of nectar. But hopefully we plant other species to go along with it because for bumblebees, they actually only use bee balm as a nectar source, not as a pollen source. And they get their pollen from other plants. So this plant is great for carbohydrates, but it doesn't give them the protein and the lipids they need. And actually for bumblebees, this is true for a lot of other mint family plants too, like the hyssops and the mountain mints and the sages. These are really good sources of nectar for bumblebees, but they don't tend to collect pollen from these plants. I should say that other wild bees, as well as non-bee insects, butterflies likely still could be using the resources from these plants. Other wild bees might be using pollen from these plants as well. So by no means it's not a suggestion to stop planting these plants. It's just that for bumblebees specifically, only having these plants around won't quite be enough. Okay, so I guess stocking the grocery store with plants that provide bees with both nectar and pollen can be pretty important. And actually, I should mention that bees can get their nectar from a variety of different flower sources, but it's less so for pollen. And so again, this is a list that I took from Heather Holmes. She has a whole bunch of really good plant recommendations. And she has a whole bunch of them kind of categorized into different plant families. So the Fabaceae plant family Susan mentioned, that's the pea plant family. There are a lot of different species that are really good for both pollen and nectar there, as well as in the rose family, the heath family, and the aster family. That's not to say that plants that only provide bees with nectar aren't important too. And so, for example, some of these early flowering plants like Virginia waterleaf, Dutchman's breeches, willow, bumblebees don't collect pollen from these, but they can actually be really important sources of fuel for bees early in the season because bumblebees are just waking up from hibernation, the queens are, and they really need to fuel up because they haven't eaten all winter. And then on top of that, even if bumblebees specifically aren't using these plants for pollen, there are a ton of other bee species as well as other insects that might be using pollen from these plants. And specifically, mason bees, I know, will use Virginia waterleaf pollen as well as willow pollen. And there's even a mining bee who specializes on willow pollen. And I'll talk more about specialization later on. Okay, so having plants that provide bees with enough quantity of nectar and pollen can be important, but it turns out that the quality of nectar and pollen is important too. So what is actually in that pollen and nectar? And I think this isn't too different, again, from how we think about human nutrition, because we get different amounts of nutrients like carbohydrates and proteins and lipids by eating different kinds of foods. And similarly, pollen and nectar can contain different amounts of these macronutrients, depending on the plant that we're talking about. And so I could say a lot about what's in nectar and pollen. I'm going to focus on what's in pollen for today, again, because it's kind of the more important aspect here in terms of bee reproduction. Now, protein and lipids in our food can really vary, right? So a cup of red lentils can have 18 grams of protein, whereas a cup of almonds will have 30 grams of protein. It's quite similar when we're thinking about flowers. So nodding onion pollen has 2 times more protein than dandelion pollen. And this is based on work from Christina Grosinger's lab and also members of her lab. She's an entomology prof at Penn State, and she does all kinds of interesting work looking at what bees are getting from pollen. So essentially, pollen can be very different nutritionally depending on what plant they're coming from. And in general, based on some experiments that they did in the lab where they had bees choose between different pollen diets with different protein in it, bees seem to prefer pollen that has more protein. And actually not just more protein, but specifically more protein relative to fat, right? Because if you remember, pollen contains both protein and fat. And I'll add that actually the authors of this study showed that pollen with very high amounts of fat actually increased mortality in bees. So they're looking for high protein compared to fat. Now, it's just like how we humans, we vary in the amount of carbs and proteins and lipids that we need to get by. Different bees also vary. And so in that same study, they tested different bees, and they found that bumblebees, specifically the common eastern bumblebee, they were collecting pollen at a ratio of on average with a ratio of 4 protein to 1 lipid. The mason bee was collecting pollen averaging a 3-to-1 ratio for protein, and then honeybees, which aren't native, were collecting pollen averaging a 1.5-to-1 ratio for protein to lipid. So definitely a spectrum among bees in terms of what they need, where some, like the bumblebees, might need a lot more protein, and others, like honeybees, seem to need less. Now, you might imagine that knowing what plants have pollen with lots of protein compared to lipids might be pretty useful if we want to stock our bee grocery stores with food that's nutritious for bees. And so luckily, again, this is work done by Dr. Grosinger and members of her lab. They actually measured the relative amounts of these nutrients in pollen of flowers that bees are found to visit in this area. And so she has this ginormous table of a whole bunch of plants that they measured with the pollen to lipid ratio of each plant. And I thought it was just pretty cool to look through the list of what plants are there. So basically the plants up here are ones that have more protein compared to lipids. They have a higher P to L ratio. And a lot of the plants that we see in pollinator gardens are there. So like Gapostaman and St. John's worts, columbine, there's our wild onion. And there are also some trees in there like black locust, shrubs like hawthorn. I thought what was also interesting was to look at, so these are the top 25. I thought it was also interesting to look at the bottom half of their table in terms of what has the lowest protein to lipid ratio. And interestingly, a lot of plants in the aster family have very low protein. Things like New England aster, Joe Pyeweed, boneset, black-eyed Susan, dandelion, and goldenrod, they all seem to kind of be at the bottom of the scale. And I thought that was really interesting because so many of these plants kind of make up the core of pollinator seed mixes, and they tend to be featured very prominently in a lot of pollinator gardens. And so what does this mean? Well, I'm absolutely not suggesting that we should avoid planting these plants. And if anything, I hope we can plant them more, just because they're so beautiful and they're important to so many other critters. But firstly, I think these asters can be especially important because they tend to be more abundant late in the season when maybe not a lot of other plants are blooming, which is something Susan mentioned earlier. There are also bee species that specialize specifically on aster pollen, which sounds a bit funny because it has low protein, but I'll talk about this a little later on. There are also studies done on how aster pollen can actually serve as a kind of medicine for certain bee species, and that when they consume it, they're able to fight off pathogen infections a bit better. So having some of these plants around is almost like stocking our grocery store with bee medicine in addition to food. And then I think we also need to keep other critters other than bees in mind, like butterflies and also beetles and ants and flies. Lots of other things use asters, and they're very important for other creatures as well. So hopefully we can continue to have lots of asters in our landscapes. We just might want to make sure that there are also other resources representing other plant families in there, so that bees that maybe need more protein will have access to nutritious pollen diets. Okay, so that was a lot just for that first one for nutrition. And hopefully that wasn't too boggling. I think for me, the big takeaway, the more I read and listen and observe bees in the field, is that often I'll see bees visiting certain flowers, and now I realize there's so much going on that we might not be able to tell, because I think I'd often see a whole bunch of bumblebees visiting bee balm and hyssop, and I'd think, wow, these plants are really good for them. But now I know they probably need more than that, because they're probably just getting nectar from those plants. And similarly, in the spring, we might see a ton of insects on dandelions, but now we know that the pollen quality of that plant isn't the best in terms of protein. So maybe they need something more than just a lawn full of dandelions. Okay, I'll move on to diet specialization. And again, I'll make analogies to our human communities. We have all different kinds of diets. Maybe folks are vegan or they're lactose intolerant, they have allergies. It's similar with insects and bees specifically. There are bees that go just for specific plant families, and there are also bees that go for lots of different plants. And so entomologists refer to this distinction in bee diets as specialist bees, so oligolectic bees, and generalist bees, so polyelectic. Right, so I guess generalist bees are like those of us who kind of eat anything and everything, and specialists are those of us who only go for certain foods. Now, I think one thing that's important to note is that when I talk about bees being specialists, they're specializing specifically on the pollen of the plant, not the nectar. And so specialists can be found visiting other plants outside of their specific plants. It's the pollen that they're specializing on. And they're using that pollen both to consume for themselves and to feed their offspring. And so because male bees don't actually help with raising offspring, they're kind of just there to mate and to, I guess, sleep in flowers at night. this specialization thing is mostly specific to females. And so all that's to say that having lots of different flowers in a garden is still helpful for a specialist bee, even if they don't use it for pollen, because they might visit those flowers for nectar, or the male bees will be interested in them. And there are a number of specialist bees in Ottawa. These are just a few of them. We have a mining bee that specializes only on pollen in Claytonia and spring beauties. We have this yellow loose-striped bee that specializes on oils produced by plants in the genus Lysomachia. This tiny sweat bee, which specializes on evening primrose. And it's a really interesting relationship because the females of this species actually have special hairs that are perfect for catching on to the pollen grains of this plant. And then we also have the bellflower resin bee that specializes on flowers in the harebell family. And I actually wonder if they're doing particularly well in the city because so many urban lots are kind of run over by creeping bellflower, which I recognize is non-native, but it's in the harebell family, and I do see the bellflower resin bee using it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we have a bunch of bees that specialize on aster family plants, which again seems strange because I talked about how aster pollen has very low protein, and presumably these bees need protein to reproduce properly. Now that said, I think different bees, I also mentioned that different bees require different amounts of protein in their diets. So maybe these species have evolved to tolerate lower levels of protein. And you can imagine that could be a good trade-off because asters are so abundant and prolific at the end of the season. It's kind of this very predictable and stable resource that could be very helpful to specialize on. I wanted to mention this website that I can share after, put together by Jarrett Fowler, who's an entomologist. He basically has this big table of a list of pollen specialist bees found in the eastern United States, and they're similar to our area too. And they're all the specialists when they're active and what they specialize on. And so I found this table pretty helpful in terms of just knowing what species are specialists. So there are a lot of specialist bees, but the majority of bees in our area are generalists. These are things like bumblebees. A lot of sweat bees are generalists. I think Jarrett Fowler has it that 75% are generalists. And so here are just some photos and videos I've taken of the bicolored Gapostaman in the city. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this bee. And here we see her going to lots of different plant families. There she's on some vetch, so it's a pea family. Here she's in a mustard in Dame's rocket. And here she's collecting pollen from thistle, so in the aster family. I guess the thing to think about here in terms of specialist and generalist bees is the fact that maybe these specialist species could be having a harder time in terms of finding suitable habitat in the city because a specialist female will need to find a nesting site that's close to her specific preferred host plants, and maybe those aren't always available. So maybe that's something we can think about as gardeners too. Okay, so that was diet specialization. The last one I had for today was physical access, and I'll go through this one fairly quickly because I think it's fairly intuitive and probably easier for us to observe. And essentially, I think physical access of flowers is something that could be very important because bees are so varied in their sizes. This is a tiny sweat bee that was in my garden in Toronto, and I put this dime by her doorway to show how tiny she is. So bees can be very small, but they can also be very large, like this big bumblebee. And that ultimately plays a big role in terms of the flowers that they can access, because not only do they vary in size, but they also vary in tongue length. So whether or not they can even reach the resources in the flowers. And so some bees have very, very short tongues, especially if they're small to begin with. Some bees have longer tongues, like the leaf-cutting bee family. They have longer tongues, and definitely bumblebees have longer tongues. And so, for example, it would take a relatively big bee, a big and strong bee with at least a very long tongue to access the pollen and nectar in certain flowers. And these are things like Dutchman's breeches and turtlehead. Blue lobelia have very deep flowers. Bottle gentian, the bee actually has to kind of pry open the petals to get inside. Same with pea family plants and penstemon. So kind of these more complex shaped flowers requires a bee that is adequately sized, but also one with a long tongue that can reach the nectar that can be very far deep into the flower. And so that's why flowers with more open structures, including a lot of the asters, but also plants in the figwort family, so that's like Culver's root, plants in the rose family, so a lot of our fruit trees, strawberries, cinquefoil, and our wild roses. These flowers have structures that allow for both the big guys and the little guys to get in. Right, so if I were to go back to my analogy of the grocery store, we wouldn't want to put all the nutritious food on the highest shelves away from the smaller statured people in the society. Instead, we want to have flowers that represent a mix of shapes and sizes that can be helpful for making our grocery store accessible to bees of all sizes. Okay, so those are my three things. I know I went through lots of different things, and I realized that maybe it doesn't seem like there's a really concrete takeaway in terms of what exactly one should plant in a garden. But in a way, I feel like that's quite realistic because bees and other insects, butterflies, beetles, they're so varied in what they need and prefer. So I'm not sure I could ever conclude that there's a specific set of plants that will make for the best pollinator garden. What I will say is that one of my lab mates, Batul Hijazi, she just graduated with her master's from Jessica Forrest's lab. She wrote this really cool paper where basically she picked out all the research articles from recent years that have looked at the relationship between the diversity of flowers and the diversity of bees in a given area. And what she did find was that the more plants in a given area, the more different kinds of plants, the more different kinds of bees they were observing. So more plant diversity in general meant more bee diversity. And so maybe the takeaway of all this information about nutrition and access and nectar and pollen is simply to plant diversely as we can. And just to wrap up, I think I've made a lot of analogies to human grocery stores and how humans think of nutrition. I can't help but kind of extend that parallel further in saying that in just the way that I always hope we can build cities where the environment is accessible and welcoming to diverse human people, I hope the same for our non-human neighbors, including bees and butterflies. And I'm pretty sure that in many ways, more often than not, I think these two hopes can kind of go hand in hand. Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank you for listening. And I think Susan and I would be happy to do our best to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much. And I've got a couple locked and loaded. So while people are thinking about their questions, I'm actually going to probably get everybody to unmute. Or let's see if I can do this. Let's see. Well, people can ask their questions in there. So a couple of things that I noticed. First of all, so all the bees that I see in the morning that are snoozing on those flowers, they're all males. They're all the ladies. I love going to the park, you know, or just walking around the neighborhood early in the morning and finding those bees, because that's the only time you can get a really good photograph of them sometimes.
Yeah.
You had mentioned that the pollen from asters, there's some evidence that it helps bees fight off, or, you know, it could be a medicine for them, right? And Susan, I've seen monarch butterflies all over New England asters. Would butterflies also be using pollen as a medicine? I don't it just sort of struck me, but
Yeah, that's interesting. To be honest, this is the first, like Lydia's presentation is I'm learning that that pollen can be medicine. Um, I'm not really aware of butterflies using pollen really. They're basically there for the nectar. So I'm not really sure that they would use it in the same way. But that's something that I should maybe read up on.
yeah,
'Cause it is really interesting.
okay. And what about, what is there, I know most people do ask this, I've had this asked before, is the impact of some of the commercial beehives on native species. I know just in this area, there was a business park that had 3 hives. They've since gone down to 1, and I'm not sure if they decided to do that. But, you know, I still see bumblebees and other insects at that park. But is there an impact of the commercial hives that you're seeing?
Well, not, I guess I haven't been like carefully like measuring. There are people who have studied how the proximity of commercial hives to like natural places affects how many other wild bees that they're observing there. And usually there is a negative effect just because honeybees are so numerous. There's, you know, their colonies can have thousands and thousands of workers, whereas most bees are solitary. It's like 1 female versus 1,000. So not only do honeybees take up a lot of resources, but they can also be like antagonistic on flowers. They can be seen knocking other little bees off of flowers. They can spread diseases. So I think it's not to say that honeybees are bad, because they, you know, obviously they're people's livelihoods that require them, and you know, it's a big industry. I think we just need to think about them differently, almost thinking about them as farm animals. I'm sure many people have heard that analogy.
Yeah. Okay, well, we've got a couple of questions coming in. One is, where can we find the information on the different nutritional value of the nectar? And I think you were going to either post a link, or Lydia, I think you had a chart of that.
Yeah, I can definitely post that. It was in a paper by Christina Grosinger.
Okay.
And I think it was 2020, but I can post it.
Okay. And we got another one. Like, do bees shop for pollen versus nectar at different times of the day, or are they more opportunistic and just take what's close, you know, what's close by? Are they more active in general at certain times of the day?
Yeah, I think they definitely do shop for different products at different times of the day. It depends on the species, but I think a lot of species, the first trip the female makes is often a nectar trip, because I guess they need to fuel up for the day.
Right.
Because when they're shopping for pollen, it's almost like they're, you know, doing groceries for their children.
Right.
Whereas the first one in the morning, they kind of need to fuel up so that they have energy to shop for the children, I guess.
Right. It's their coffee.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody had a question about if there's any suggestions on where to purchase native seed packets for those various flowers. Because I know sometimes the native seed packets, you know, you may not be able to trust all of them. I'm not sure. You really have to carefully sort of see which all of the seeds in there. I know the Ottawa Wildflower Seed Library is a very good source of native seed. So you can try them as well. But do you guys have any particular suggestions in Ottawa?
So I don't have one actually. Where is this? So my parents, I spent a bit of time trying to find, my parents and I were both trying to find a good source for wildflowers. So my family has actually had really good, I'm just trying to figure out where this place is, really good experiences with this one, Coldwater, Ontario. Is that near here?
Coldwater? I don't know.
I
Anybody?
have no idea. Anyway, okay, so you can order seeds from this place online.
Yeah.
They have really good seed mixes, and I've actually looked through, because it is true, sometimes you see wildflower seed mixes and they are not actually all native. I don't really know. Yeah, I don't know why that makes sense, but
Right.
but these are native species. The only one I think that is not native is there's an all annual seed mix. But I think I've looked through most of the other ones and they are natives. So
Okay.
yeah, I would definitely.
Okay.
Oh, North Berry. Oh, thanks.
Yeah, well, or like I said, try support the Wildflower Seed Library if you can, and I'll put a link in with the video once we load it up onto YouTube. So we've got another question here. Is it possible that by the end of the summer, when asters bloom, bees don't have the same requirement for proteins because they are done raising their offspring, so that their nutrient needs are different at this time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's actually probably precisely it, especially because the colonies, for thinking about a bumblebee colony, kind of I guess the production of babies is kind of slowing down. And so we're kind of maybe just getting adult bees, workers who are kind of just, I guess they're almost like out of work. They're done raising or like, bringing pollen to the nest, and they just kind of need a lot of sugar to sustain themselves. And definitely asters can be really good end of season sugar sources. And also even those aster specialists that I was talking about that are collecting the pollen, they tend to be active late in the season. And so maybe that also has to do with kind of the timing aspect here.
Okay. Will the presentation be available to download? Well, we will be putting it up on YouTube, but I don't know, Lydia or Susan, did you want, if you are comfortable sending me your presentations, I could
Sure.
make those available to anybody who wants. And then so just email the carlingtonhampton@gmail.com and we can arrange to get those to you. Oh, and Coldwater, someone, Iola, thank you very much, is near Georgian Bay. So I don't know, Lydia, I think you were looking at some of the chat as well. Let's see, somebody, Bozar in Gatineau also sells native seeds and mixes. Thank you. Let's see. And there's the wildflower. Thank you, Nora, for posting the seed library link for that. So I don't see any more questions. And I think we are almost bang on 8:30. So unless anybody's got any other questions, I want to thank you so much, Susan and Lydia. Again, I had such a good time looking at all those photographs, and I scribbled down a whole bunch of notes. I don't know why we're recording this, so I can go back and check anyway. So depending on if my computer behaves, this should be up in, by about the weekend, Saturday, Sunday. Yeah, is there anything coming in for a last question? I don't think so. I think these are all the thanks to you all. So yes, have yourselves a lovely evening, people. And again, thank you, Susan and Lydia, and I will see you in the woods.
Thanks so much, Sharon. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, Sharon. And thanks everyone for coming.
Yes.